They also say garlic is not only antibacterial, but also antiviral and antiparasitic. Now, the antibacterial component is only about 1/10 as strong as a prescription antibiotic, and that also depends on the antibiotic. So it's definitely a lot weaker, but it's more natural, and again, it can also help get rid of parasites, as well as viruses, which is kind of cool. Alright, so the vegetables have been chopped and added to the bowl here. I actually had some extra vegetables, so I have a couple extra bowls, but we'll work with this one for now. So the next step is adding salt to the vegetables, and then letting it sit for about an hour or so the vegetables begin to dehydrate. We want the salt to pull the liquid out of the vegetables to then act as the brine solution. Alright, so for a bowl this size, I usually recommend anywhere from 2 to 5 teaspoons of salt. But you kind of have to play it by ear depending on how much vegetable you have, how salty you want it, and how fast the vegetables are dehydrating. Some people will actually add the salt and then rinse the salt off afterward, because they don't have the salt in the fermented vegetables they make. Me personally, I don't use that much. I tend to leave it. I think salt does have its benefits, and as long as you don't have high blood pressure, having a little salt in your diet really isn't too big of an issue. Especially if you're an active person, you do a lot of sweating. The salts act as they're electrolytes, so they're a way of replenishing electrolytes without drinking, sugary electrolyte beverages that have a lot of food dyes and other stuff. So I'm going to start with about 3 tablespoons of salt here. I'm just sprinkling it around. And the next step you can do, you can kind of shake it in, but some people actually recommend massaging the vegetables, as crazy as that sounds. Actually getting in here with your hands, mixing the vegetables, and then as the vegetables start to sit with the salt, actually kind of squeeze and knead the vegetables. I'll show you a little bit more of that once it starts to dehydrate, but to actually squeeze out some of the liquid to start creating that brine solution that will be necessary when we go to jar it. Okay, so the vegetables have been sitting with the salt for a little bit. They're starting to get a little bit dehydrated. So now it's time to add in the fermentation starter. Technically, you don't even really need anything to start. I believe the author of The Art of Fermentation says you don't even really need to put any starter bacteria in, simply because there's natural bacteria living on the skins of the vegetables that will start the fermentation process. However, that might take a little bit longer. So if you want to kickstart it, you can sometimes add in some sort of starter. You can actually buy a vegetable starter fermentation pack. I already have some other fermented foods that I make, so I tend to pull from those. So here I added a little bit of homebrewed kombucha, water kefir. I put in a little bit of apple cider vinegar, and some other probiotics just to mix in. There's different opinions about what to put in terms of starter bacteria. Some people say that you don't want to put certain strains of bacteria in, simply because it could slightly change the taste. Others say it might throw off the natural succession of bacteria, because different bacteria will be fermenting at different times over the next couple of weeks as these continue to ferment. I've never had an issue with this. This is what I always use, and it's always worked for me. Another thing you can add, and I actually did add a little of this in, some previous brine from a previous fermented vegetable batch. So I saved some of the extra brine from my last batch, I add that in. Some people say that if you use that pre-solution from your last batch, it might make the vegetables a little bit softer. So if you want to soften the vegetable a little bit more, that's fine. I really didn't notice that at all, but that was just one article that I've read. So I'm going to pour this in. Just kind of pour it around, smell a little bit. And I'm going to let that continue to sit a little bit. Hopefully it'll dehydrate a little bit further. And once the dehydration process gets a little bit further along, I'll show you how to start packing into the jars for the actual fermentation process. Okay, so the vegetables have been sitting for a few hours now, and as you can see, there's a lot of brine in there. A lot of liquid has come out of the vegetables, and just the whole bowl overall, everything's gotten very compressed, very low down. So I'm going to give it one last squeeze and just one last mix, and then I'm going to start loading them, packing into the jars for the fermentation process. So for this, you just kind of grab the vegetables, give it a squeeze. Try to squeeze any extra liquid in here. Give it a good kneading. Again, you don't have to go through this process of kneading the vegetables with your hands. Some people recommend it, but if it's not something, if you really don't want to be putting your hands in your food, there's really no problem. You just might not be able to pack as much into the jar as you would if you had taken the time to go through and kind of squeeze out some of the extra liquid. Alright, so now I'm going to show you how to pack the vegetables into the jar. Very simple. You just take some of the vegetables and start to fill it in. Once you've got a fair amount of vegetable packed into the jar, you can then use some kind of tool, either your hands, a spoon. I use this. It goes with my smoothies. The blender that I got, so it's for packing and stuff as you're putting it through the blender, and I use this to help kind of compress the vegetables down. So once I have some in there, take this, and I use that to compress the vegetables. It's pretty simple, and you just kind of repeat this process for each jar. Another important thing to remember is that we want to make sure that there's enough brine solution covering the vegetables. We don't want the vegetables exposed to air, because that's when things that we don't want to grow could potentially grow. Okay, you don't want any fungus or mold or things like that growing in there. So you need to make sure everything in the container is submerged. If you don't have enough brine solution, that's okay. All you have to do is add some water, and as this continues to ferment, that water will become a fermentation solution as well. Another thing to note, we don't want to fill the jar all the way to the top. We want to try to leave at least half an inch to an inch from the top of the jar, because what happens is as the bacteria ferment the carbohydrates in the vegetables, many of them will produce different types of gas, and that gas could ultimately explode the jar. So we don't want the jar to be to break. You don't want to walk home to a kitchen full of broken glass shards. So the two things to do with this: make sure that you leave enough space, and then you just have to open the jars periodically. I recommend opening the jars at least twice a day. So try for at least every 12 hours. You're going to open the jar, let out the gaseous pressure, so the jars don't blow up. And I've never had a problem with the jar exploding, but I wouldn't want that to happen to someone. Now, the fermentation process usually takes about 3 to 4 days to start. The full fermentation can take up to sometimes a couple of weeks. But after the